What is going on, everybody, and welcome back to the JW Football Show. Today, we are going to be doing my very first mock draft of the 2026 offseason. I'm a little bit under the weather, but I really feel like we need to go through this. Obviously, now that free agency has mostly concluded, we have about a month and a half until the draft. So, perfect time to look at what some of these teams might be doing. So, let's get right into it. So, obviously got the PFF mock draft simulator already pulled up here, got all 32 teams selected. Obviously some teams don't have first round picks. I would love to get to like maybe a 2-round mock draft at some point. That way we can get every team at least one pick. But for now we're just going to stick with the first round. So let's just get right into it. Go ahead and enter draft. So obviously Raiders first overall. I'm sure a lot of you have already seen. It's going to be pretty much Fernando Mendoza for every single person you listen to talk about the draft. It's becoming unexciting for Raiders fans, but Fernando Mendoza is a very good prospect. Obviously, the Heisman winner, had an incredible year this past year at Indiana, winning the national championship. Some people have said that Fernando Mendoza isn't really worth like the first overall pick in most classes. I actually disagree. Is he a Caleb Williams type prospect? Not necessarily. But he is still very, very good. I think I'd probably have him somewhere in the realm of like where Cam Ward was last year as a prospect in general. Mendoza reminds me a little bit of like a maybe slight step down of like Trevor Lawrence, how he is now. Not necessarily as a prospect, but a big, tall dude. Can make every throw on the field. Has some pretty plus level processing ability. So I think he has a lot of potential, and especially in a Kubiak-led offense. I'm really excited to see what Mendoza might do with Las Vegas. So that's going to be my first overall pick there. The Jets, which I feel like this pick has kind of, become sort of chalky too. I'm going to stick with Arvell Reese here. Kind of that linebacker edge hybrid out of Ohio State. Arvell Reese is really just a defensive weapon at this point. It sounds like he thinks he's going to kind of make the transition to full-time pass rusher or edge rusher. I think that would be the case here if he went to the Jets. Obviously, he wasn't asked to do it a whole lot at Ohio State, but just with the physical tools and his power profile, I do think he has the ability to be a very, very good edge rusher. It's just kind of a little bit of a projection. I do think the Jets have some room to do that, though. They can kind of bet on a player like this. They've made a lot of, solid veteran additions on their defense. You got guys like Demario Davis and Minkah Fitzpatrick in the building now, so they need some, real top-level talent on defense, and I think Arvell Reese has the potential to be that for you. So we're going to go with him at number 2 here. Number 3, the Arizona Cardinals. Obviously, we talked about in our free agency review, Kyler Murray's gone now. You have a new head coach. They're kind of hitting, not the full rebuild button, but, in a heavy retool, we'll call it. And I think this is a spot where they'd love to trade back, just, based on their needs. There's not really a quarterback here worth taking. I think they'd think about Sonny Styles here. I don't really think Jeremiah Love is really in the picture anymore with, James Conner getting re-signed and bringing in Tyler Algier. I think for our purposes here, I am going to make a pick. And I think their biggest need is still along the offensive line, especially at right tackle. And you have 2 really good ones here. Obviously, Francis Mauigoa was rock solid this year, for the runner-ups in the Hurricanes. He's been a 3-year starter at right tackle for Miami, and he's played at a very, very high level. So I'd be very comfortable with that pick. And then Spencer Fano, same kind of deal. Been a really, really good starter for Utah over the past 2 seasons. He wasn't quite as good this year as he was last year, but after, his stellar on-field testing at the Combine, and then this is a story for another day, but they had those weird kind of arm gate kind of accusations at the Combine where people's arm length was off. And then Spencer Fano had like 3/4 of an inch longer arms at his pro day. So not really sure what's going on with that, but I think both these guys would be really, really good picks. I'm going to go with Mauigoa for now, just because I think he had a better year this year. And he doesn't really have any concerns as far as, his physical ability goes. So we're going to go with him. I think he's a really safe prospect. Maybe not like an absolute home run, but I think at the very worst will be very, very solid for you. The Titans, I think they could go in a lot of different directions, but I'm going to kind of go with what I've been hearing from a lot of other people, and that's Jeremiah Love. I think Jeremiah Love, if you kind of look outside the positional value thing, is absolutely a top 3 player in the draft. So, obviously he's worth this pick here at number 4. But the Titans have done a really good job of addressing some of their biggest needs. They've brought in some really good front seven players. They brought in 2 or 3 new starting corners. So they don't really have that many like absolute like glaring needs on defense anymore. I do still think they can make some improvements along the offensive line, but with, they bring in Wan'Dale Robinson. They had the 2, pretty good receivers from last year's class. I think pairing Cam Ward with a guy like Jeremiah Love in the backfield just opens up your offense so much more than what they've done in the past. And that's not to say that Tony Pollard's not a good player or that, Tyjae Spears isn't an okay rotational guy. But I think Jeremiah Love is just kind of a different level of player than them and definitely worth the 4th overall pick. So we're going to take him there for the Titans. The New York Giants, another team that's done a pretty good job of addressing some of their biggest needs. They obviously bring Jermaine Illuminor back. They bring in Tremaine Edmonds. I don't think bringing in Tremaine Edmonds would stop you from considering Sonny Styles here. They could still use a safety. I think John Harbaugh, after coaching a guy like Kyle Hamilton over the past few years, would definitely see the value in bringing in a guy like Caleb Downs. So that's another position we'll consider here. I also think the Giants would be a team that could consider trading back. I don't think they'd want to trade back like ridiculously far, just because they do still have some needs on this roster. But if you remember from last year, they traded up into the first round to select Jackson Dart, which cost them a 3rd round pick. So I think they could recoup some of that value here with a trade down. One of the teams I think would be really interested in trading up, I think, well, really 2 teams here would be the Kansas City Chiefs and Cincinnati Bengals. Both teams who, have some very, very talented players on their roster, but could use, especially on defense, some, more top tier level playmakers. I think the Chiefs, you could do something like 9-74 to come up to 5. And then I think the Bengals something like 10-72. You're looking at very, very similar value there. And if you're the Giants, you're getting, pretty much the same value back. So I definitely would consider one of these. I feel like if it's Ruben Bain, we would come up for, if it was the Chiefs, we would come up for Ruben Bain. And if you're looking at Cincinnati, maybe they come up for a guy like Sonny Styles. I think because the Chiefs got that extra 1st round pick in the Trent McDuffie trade, I think I might have them trade up here. I think I'm going to have, not sure why that's not working here. There we go. Go ahead and force that trade. I think we're going to have, excuse me. I think we're going to call it 9-74 for pick 5. We're going to go ahead and go that through. And I think the Chiefs coming up here and selecting a guy like Ruben Bain, I think would be perfect for them. On their defense over the past, decade or so, they've really liked those heavier, kind of versatile defensive ends. You have a guy like George Karlaftis there who's kind of been a similar thing. Even Chris Jones has been asked to do some of that, edge pass rush work over the past few years. So I think bringing in Ruben Bain to a defensive line that could use some additional pass rush juice, especially as Chris Jones' career kind of, is in the back half at the very least. I really like that pick. I think it's worth an extra 3rd that you give up to come up to this spot. So I really like that for the Chiefs. We're going to go with Ruben Bain there. The Browns, this is going to be another pick that I'm going to kind of trust my ears more than my eyes. And I'm going to go with Monroe Freeling, the left tackle of Georgia. Obviously was an absolute stud at the combine. Measured in like 6'7", ran a really good 40, had super long arms. The other thing is that he's one of the few like true left tackles in this class. It's kind of like him, Caden Proctor, and Caleb Lomu. I would say he has the most upside of those 3. Personally, I wouldn't take him at 6 just because I do still think he has some steps to take, especially as far as his, run blocking goes. I think he has to fill out his frame a little bit more. But I've heard a lot of buzz around, the Browns being really interested in him in the top 10. And I think with the rest of the additions they've made along their offensive line and free agency, I think Monroe Freeling's like kind of a nice cherry on top there as a potential franchise left tackle. So we're going to go with the Commanders here. Another team that I think could do a couple of different things. I do still think regardless, they bring in Odafe Owe and K'Lavon Chaisson. I do still think they consider David Bailey. Chaison's on a 1-year deal, and their pass rush was so bad last year that I'm not really sure if you can make enough, additions to a team like that. I also think they'd consider Styles and Downs. Obviously, they bring in Leo Chenal. Doesn't mean you can't have 2 good linebackers. And then Caleb Downs, they brought in Nick Cross, but they could definitely still use improvements there. I think they could also trade back. They're a team that has very few picks. What is that? They have 6 picks this year, 2 of which are in the 7th round. So they're another team that could look to, gain some value back by trading down. I'm just not really sure, who would be trading up. Like a team like Dallas, I think would love to trade up for Sonny Styles. I just don't think they have the capital to do it. So in this spot, as much as I love Sonny Styles, I think I am going to go Caleb Downs. I think Caleb Downs would end up being my number one player in this class. Just a rock solid prospect. I feel like a can't miss type of prospect. It's just a matter of how much do you value, box safety, which is kind of what he's going to play. But I think in the Dan Quinn defense, he's, kind of a playmaker they're missing on the back end. So I really do like that pick for Washington. Moving on to the Saints. I think the Saints actually have a really good board here. They brought in Caden Ellis, but they lost to Mario Davis, so I think Sonny Styles can make a lot of sense. I think Mansour Delane to go across from Kool-Aid McKinstry after losing Alontae Taylor can make a lot of sense. And then Carnell Tate as that kind of wide receiver 2 behind Chris Olave, kind of a different type of body type than Olave has, more of a big physical 50-50 type player. I really think all of those picks would make a lot of sense for the Saints. I think I'm just going to stay true to the board. I would have Sonny Styles above Carnell Tate as a prospect in general. So I think I am going to go with Sonny Styles. Obviously, an all-time combine performance a couple of weeks ago. He had an unbelievable year this year at Ohio State. Another guy that I just think you can't really see a world in which he is not at least a good NFL player. And I think odds are he's going to be a great one. Albeit at maybe a less valuable position, but I think the Saints are really trending in the right direction. You want to continue that with a guy as talented as Sonny Styles. Now the Giants back up after that trade they made with the Chiefs. They're at 9. I still really like the board for them. They could go corner. They did bring in Greg Newsome on a 1-year deal. So I'm not sure if that takes Mansour Delane out of the equation. For me, it wouldn't. But so you consider that. As much as I love Darnell Mooney, as you guys know, I love me some Darnell Mooney. They still really do need receiver. You have Neighbors. Now you have Mooney. You have, Darius Slayton. And after that, it's kind of nothing, unless you are really a believer in Jalen Hyatt. Excuse me. Unless you're really a believer in Jalen Hyatt. I'm not personally, so I think I'm going to go Carnell Tate here. You're hoping that Jackson Dart's your franchise quarterback. And, you have to make sure that if that's the case, you are surrounding him with the best possible players. And I think Carnell Tate is right now my top player on the board probably. And definitely still a position of need. So I'm going to kind of stick with my gut there, go Carnell Tate. Now Cincinnati up, a lot of good options. They did bring in Boye Mafe and they drafted Shamar Stewart last year in the first round. So, David Bailey as a rotational pass rusher, maybe day 1. And then hopefully, eventually becomes that standout guy. I think that can make some sense. I also think even after bringing in Brian Cook from the Chiefs, I think Dylan Thieneman could make a lot of sense. Not to say Jordan Battle's a bad player, but I do still think that, Thieneman brings something that, they don't really have as far as athleticism goes. I still think they'd be a team that would maybe trade back here if they don't, want to spend another first round pick on an edge rusher. And maybe don't feel comfortable investing that much in the safety position. One team that I think could come up is the Buccaneers. They kind of just have their picks this draft, 1 in each round. And they're not always a team that is super aggressive as far as trading up goes. But they kind of swung and missed on the edge pass rusher market this offseason. And I think to make up for that, I am going to have them trade their first round pick this year in pick 15, a third round pick, and then a day 3 pick next year to come up to 10 and take David Bailey. They've really struggled getting after the passer, and I think they've had a hard time fixing that just because they're usually picking in the 20s somewhere. This year obviously didn't go the way they wanted, especially the second half of the season kind of collapsed at the end. So I think David Bailey is a much needed presence as far as edge pass rusher goes, and it's hard to do it unless you get up into the top 10. And I think they finally bite the bullet and say, you know what, we got to fix it. And they do that here with David Bailey. Number 11, the Dolphins, who just recently traded Jalen Waddle to the Broncos. This team is really, really bad, man. I don't really know how else to say it. just so many needs. You could really go anywhere here, and you could convince me that it's a great pick. I think I am going to go Mansour Delane. I think corner is probably their most bleak looking position. And Mansour Delane's the top player on the board. Obviously had a really, really good year this year for LSU. Both man and zone, really solid across the board. I think, Jeff Hafley's a defensive minded guy. I think starting that with a potential CB1 is a really good process, so I'm going to kind of stick with him there. Dallas, I've liked a lot of what Dallas has done this offseason. I do still think they have some needs, especially along kind of that spine of their defense, especially after trading Oso Odighizuwa. I think maybe he was just kind of the odd man out with Kenny Clark and Quinnen Williams already there. With that being said, I know they brought in Jalen Thompson from the Cardinals, but I do think I'm going to draft Dylan Thieneman here, a guy who's really, risen up draft boards since his combine. A really good athlete, really good tape, has shown an ability to come downhill and tackle, to play true middle of the field, kind of just center field safety, go be a ball hawk. And as good as Jalen Thompson is, I think at this point he's more of a box kind of player. Malik Hooker's been okay for them. I think it's time to make a real upgrade, and I think Dylan Thieneman does just that. The Rams are obviously in just, full on win now mode. So to me, it's kind of who gives you the best chance of doing that. To me, it comes down to Spencer Fano and Mekhi Lemon. It kind of depends on what they think of Warren McClendon at right tackle. He stepped in this year for Rob Havenstein and played really, really well, actually. So, obviously I don't know, is that a guy they're comfortable with now moving forward? Or do they see that as kind of a one-off, he'll be your swing guy from here on out? And then Mekhi Lemon, I'd be shocked if they weren't at least somewhat concerned with Devonta Adams' health moving forward. I think at this point in his career, it's just kind of the expectation that he's going to miss, at least a few games. And I think that does hurt your not playoff chances. I think they're going to make the playoffs, but that hurts your Super Bowl chances if a guy like that isn't healthy come playoff time. And even if he is, how much longer is he going to be around, So I think I will go with Mekhi Lemon. Just really kind of fits that Sean McVay style, go over the middle of the field, make tough catches. I think he's a willing blocker despite not, necessarily being physically opposing in that way. And I think he does, do the best job of helping the Rams win right now. Kind of filling in that wide receiver 3 role for now. So I'm going to go with Mekhi Lemon there, 13 to the LA Rams. The Baltimore Ravens, another team that kind of has more needs than you'd think. They had a lot of losses this year. Obviously, they bring in Trey Hendrickson, which is a big one. But they lose out on Max Crosby after that weird situation. They lose Tyler Linderbaum. They lose Isaiah Likely. There's just been a kind of, a lot of exits this year. I think they're going to be just fine with a new coach. So there's a couple of different ways I could go here. I think it would come down for me to, Jordan Tyson, who a lot of people, including myself, would probably say is the most talented receiver in this class. Just obviously some very significant injury issues, or injury concerns, I should say. And then Vega Ioane at Penn State. He's probably the best player remaining on the board. I know here he's ranked 16. I think part of that has to do with positional value. I just think he's another guy that's really just going to be a good NFL player. And they bring in John Simpson to play right guard. They have Andrew Voorhees to play left. I'm not sure how confident they are in Voorhees moving forward. I think they'd be very confident in Vega Ioane going forward. So I'm going to go Vega Ioane. It's not the most flashy pick. I'm sure Ravens fans, I guess I don't know how they'd feel about that. I think, they might want some more playmakers, especially, since a Lamar Jackson extension might be looming here. But I think Vega Ioane is probably the best player available, so I'm going to go with him here. The Bengals up here at 15 after trading back with Tampa Bay. I think there's a couple of different ways they could go here. Again, could you go, interior defensive line? I know they brought in Jonathan Allen, but Lord knows they still need help along the defensive line. You could go linebacker. They drafted, those Barrett Carter and I'm forgetting the other guy's name out of South Carolina. Demetrius Knight, there it is. They had 2 rookie linebackers that played a significant amount last year and both really, really struggled. That's not to say that that's going to be, the case the rest of their career, but they do still have a need there. I don't think maybe they consider Emmanuel McNeil-Warren. Again, I'm not sure how willing they are to kind of double up on safety investments in this offseason. One guy that I haven't really seen paired here a lot that I actually really like is Spencer Fano. In this case, I don't think Spencer Fano would be playing right tackle. You already have two at least pretty solid tackles in Orlando Brown and Amarius Mims. Um, Orlando Brown renegotiated a new deal this offseason. Who's to say that that's going to be, kind of a long-term thing? But I think in this case, Spencer Fano would be your day one starter at one of the guard spots, and maybe even center. People have talked about his possibility of playing center. I don't want to say that's impossible. I think at the very worst, he is a plus starter somewhere along your offensive line. And with all the injury concerns to Joe Burrow, I think it just has to continue to be a priority to protect him, keep him upright. And Spencer Fano does that right away. So we're going to go with him there at 15. The Jets back up at 16 here. Obviously had them take Arvell Reese at number 2. I do still think they have pretty drastic need at receiver. Obviously you have Garrett Wilson. You traded for Adonai Mitchell. Outside of them, it's kind of, we'll just say, bleak. And I think for them, I'm actually going to go Omar Cooper Jr. I think Jordan Tyson continues to fall because of those health concerns. And Omar Cooper Jr. was absolutely stellar for Indiana this past year. As you can see, that 87 PFF grade, his teammates speak very highly of him. He tested like a very, very good athlete, and it sounds like the NFL is very high on him as well. So I definitely don't think it's out of the question for him to go, as high as 16 here. Maybe he goes even higher. Who knows come draft night. But I think he'd be a very, very good wide receiver too. Has some inside-out versatility for the Jets. I'm going to go Caden Proctor. I know some people are kind of, split on Caden Proctor. Not only, are they split on can he stick at left tackle because of some, foot speed or weight concerns. But some people think maybe he'd be better at guard. In this case, he would be the Lions' left tackle moving forward. I think he fits kind of perfectly what they want to do on offense. Kind of smash mouth, run through your face type of offense. Obviously, he's absolutely ginormous. He's listed at 6'7", over 360 pounds. I think he actually came to the combine a little lighter. And I think it would serve him well to lose a little bit more weight just to be a little bit more athletic. But I do still think he has a lot of potential, and I think this is kind of a perfect landing spot for him. The Vikings up here at 18. There's a couple of different ways they could go. For me, it comes down to a couple guys. Emmanuel McNeil-Warren being one of them. The safety at Toledo, the highest graded safety in college football this past year. Really does a good job kind of laying the boom, over the middle of the field. I think he's a little stiff as an athlete, especially in kind of open space. Hips are a little tight, isn't always the most fluid mover. But he's very, very versatile and has a lot of potential. Has really, really good size at the safety position. So I think kind of as a Harrison Smith replacement, he's a good option. I think Caden McDonald to play nose tackle. They obviously have Jalen Redmond, but they lost Javon Hargrave and Jonathan Allen. I think Jalen Redmond's kind of better as just kind of anywhere along the defensive line, not nose tackle. I think Caden McDonald would be a really, really good nose tackle for them. And then Kenyon Sadiq, they just reworked TJ Hawkinson's contract. Basically what it did is make him a free agent after this year. So Sadiq to kind of get in that tight end room and then, eventually take over those, full TE1 responsibilities next season would be really, really interesting for me. I think I'm going to go Caden McDonald for them. I really, really like the idea of having him play nose tackle and kind of letting Jalen Redmond, keep his hair on fire, get into the backfield. I think that's really, really important for a Brian Flores defense. And I think that's something that Javon Hargrave and Jonathan Allen just couldn't quite do this year. So I'm going to go Caden McDonald at 18. Panthers up at 19. They've made a lot of really, really big additions. Jalen Phillips, Devin Lloyd, both those guys getting top of the market money. And we should hopefully be really meaningful contributors on a defense that, could really use it. I think that really opens them up. They really do need center. I just don't think there's one you can take here. I think I'm going to go Kenyon Sadiq, actually. They have a lot of names in their tight end room. I shouldn't say I don't know. I'm pretty positive that none of them have the athletic capability that Kenyon Sadiq does, or the, overall upside that Kenyon Sadiq does. I think he has the ability to bring in, a much different element to their offense than they already have. Obviously, Tet, shown to be a true wide receiver one. I really like Jalen Coker. I'm not sure about Xavier Legette, which would lead me to consider Jordan Tyson here. But I think I'm going to go with Kenyon Sadiq. Tested like a freak athlete. has shown an ability to play, on the line of scrimmage in the backfield, out wide in the slot. Just a versatile weapon for Bryce Young. You got to figure out if you're going to extend Bryce Young, and I think Kenyon Sadiq helps you do that. Dallas up at pick 20. They drafted Dylan Thieneman at pick 12. I think to me it comes down to those top two guys on the board here. Is it Jermon McCoy to kind of strengthen up that cornerback room? They did just sign Kobe Durant. It was a cheap one-year deal, so that's not to say that you can't take corner. Just something to think about. I think I'll probably go CJ Allen here. They lost Jack Sanborn, which I know he wasn't necessarily the best player in the world for them last year, but they are really, really thin at linebacker. And CJ Allen, despite some of his, struggles with coverage, I think is a, day one contributor in the run game. And then you kind of hope he begins to develop those pass coverage skills. I think he'd be a day one starter for them next to DeMarvion Overshown, I really like that pick for Dallas coming out of the first round with CJ Allen and Dylan Thieneman makes a lot of sense. Pittsburgh up here at pick 21. A couple of different directions they could go. I think Ty Simpson, this is where you start to think about him. I'm not necessarily in love with him as a first round prospect, but I think if he can go to a team, assuming Aaron Rodgers comes back, obviously he hasn't made a decision yet, and I'm sure knowing Aaron Rodgers, he won't until the very last second. But if you could tell me you bring Ty Simpson and he can sit for at least a year behind Aaron Rodgers, I definitely wouldn't mind that for Pittsburgh. And I think the other direction you could go is maybe Blake Miller, a guy who's steadily gotten better over his career at Clemson. He's put in some much needed weight and strength on over the past 4 years. I think in this case, you'd slide Blake Miller into right tackle, and then Troy Fautanu, your first round pick from a few years ago, would probably play left. I really do like that too. Pittsburgh's kind of prided themselves on, having very strong offensive lines, for as long as I can remember. So I think you kind of keep that going here if you take a guy like Blake Miller, which I think I will end up doing. I just think Blake Miller's a better player than Ty Simpson. So to me, take best player available. You don't want to necessarily pigeonhole yourself into need in the first round. So we're gonna go Blake Miller. Hopefully slide Troy Fautanu over to the left side. I really like that offensive line. I think Broderick Jones just hasn't cut it. The Chargers up here at pick 22. I think there's a couple of different things they could do here as well. I really like Akeem Mesidor for them. Obviously, they brought back Khalil Mack, but it's only a one-year deal. And this will almost surely be the last year of his career. So bringing in Akeem Mesidor to, kind of for now be a rotational pass rusher. Maybe he takes over that role earlier than expected. But, at the very least next year, he's, your guy kind of. I really like the idea of that. I also think Emmanuel McNeil-Warren to add to that safety room would make a lot of sense. Obviously, Derwin James is kind of now fully transitioned over the past few years to playing that kind of nickel defender role. So having Emmanuel McNeil-Warren in the same defensive back room as Derwin James is playing in kind of the slot there, I think that makes a lot of sense to me. I think right now, man, I feel like I do really feel like Emmanuel McNeil-Warren is kind of a Jim Harbaugh guy with the way he plays. So I think I will go with Emmanuel McNeil-Warren. I'm really kind of split on that one. I think it could go either way. Obviously, Chargers fans are really going to want an offensive lineman there. Still plenty of room for improvement, especially along the interior. There's just not really a guy here that I'd feel comfortable taking at 22. And again, I don't want to pigeonhole myself into taking, a need in the first round when you have much better players available. So we're going to go with Emmanuel McNeil-Warren there. Man, the Eagles in a weird spot. Again, another team that's lost a lot this year. There's rumors of Jalen Carter maybe being, a guy that's expendable for them. And A.J. Brown, if I had to give my take on it, I would be shocked if A.J. Brown plays, this entire season on the Eagles, whether that means he's getting traded, June 1st when the money makes more sense. I think at the very latest, he's gone by the trade deadline. So I think you definitely consider a receiver here with that in mind. They did bring in Hollywood Brown to kind of be that third guy. I do really like Devontae Smith. I still don't think he's that alpha wide receiver one you're really looking for. I think the Eagles could be a Jordan Tyson team. And this is a pairing I haven't seen very much or really ever. But you do have Devontae Smith, who's proven to be at least, a Pro Bowl caliber receiver in the NFL. You have a veteran in Marquise Brown who can play. if AJ Brown's gone, wherever he might go, I think, number one, Jordan Tyson has the physical ability to take over those like true wide receiver one roles. And also because you already have some capable receivers on the roster, you have a little bit more flexibility with possible injury concerns. So I'm going to go Jordan Tyson to Philly, man. I really like that. Obviously, this is assuming AJ Brown isn't going to be on the roster. But yeah, I think if you have a receiver room of Tyson, Smith, and Brown, I think you're really living pretty good there. So I think the Browns, much to their displeasure, I think they would have loved Jordan Tyson here at 24. Obviously, they got Monroe Freeling at number 6. There are still some solid receivers on the board. I think this is kind of going to be kind of a pick where I go with a lot of what I've heard. I know the league really, really loves Denzel Boston. It's not that I don't like Denzel Boston. I just get kind of the shades of Keon Coleman, who was a draft crush of mine. I absolutely love Keon Coleman. Clearly, it hasn't really worked out so far with him in Buffalo. I get kind of shades of that with Boston, but it's not to say that he can't be a better player. I just get a little worried. If it were me, I'd be more comfortable with Boston kind of in the middle of the second round. But the Browns could really use an outside X caliber receiver. I think Boston's the best one available. So the Browns coming out of the first round with a potential starting left tackle and a potential starting X receiver. You have to bet on some upside there, but I really like those bets. They have a lot of picks, so I think they get a really good haul here. My Chicago Bears up at 25. To me, this has to be an addition along the defensive line. I didn't mean to just click that here. Let's look at D-line and edge rusher. Mesidor is a guy I really, really like. I think he makes a lot of sense. Maybe not quite the run defender or, physical presence overall that Dennis Allen would want, but he plays with his hair on fire. Obviously he's an older prospect, but the Bears are in win now mode, so I think that could make some sense there. Keldrick Falk really fits the kind of Dennis Allen mold of defensive lineman. He's huge. He has really long arms. He's pretty athletic for his size. Unfortunately, he just does not have good pass rushing tape. He's a really, really good run stopper, and I think he will be in the NFL too. But he just has a lot of work to do as far as, after actually getting after the passer goes. So despite Keldrick Falk maybe being the best fit for a Dennis Allen defense, I'm going to go with Akeem Mesidor just because I think Akeem Mesidor is a better player. And again, I know people are concerned with, well, Akeem Mesidor is going to be 25, blah, 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 blah. To me, it doesn't really matter. The Bears are in win now mode. They have a quarterback on a rookie contract. And to me, it's like, are you really going to worry about drafting Akeem Mesidor in the first round when he will almost surely be a good player for you for 5 years with his fifth year option, and then you're worried about your decision you're going to make in 2032. To me, it's just not really something to take into consideration for Chicago, and I think he's by far the best player on the board. So I'm going to go Akeem Mesidor there at pick 25 for my Chicago Bears. Bills up here. I think there's a couple of different things they could do here. For me, it comes down to two guys. Number one being Jacob Rodriguez. I know he's number 45 here on PFF's big board. I think after answering some of his, athleticism related questions at the combine, I think he's, definitely in consideration, at least in the 20s, 30s, and, back into the first round. I'd be totally comfortable taking him there. He's just such a good player. Been so productive for Texas Tech over the past 2 years. And then the other guy I would consider is actually Emmanuel Pregnon. They did lose David Edwards in free agency. Obviously, he goes over to New Orleans. They do have a need at guard. This is another, is it the most flashy type pick for Buffalo? No. But, you have a franchise quarterback. You just traded for DJ Moore. I think, obviously protecting Josh Allen should still be a priority. And Pregnon, who is an absolute freak athlete, had, by far the best year of his career this past year for the Ducks. I think he steps in as an immediately, a starting caliber guard, and I think has the potential to be even better than that. So kind of a one in, one out there at guard. I know that's not the most exciting for Bills fans, but again, with Joe Brady coming in, I think he's going to want to keep his offense rolling. Emmanuel Pregnon's kind of a butt kicker in the run game. and that's kind of what they hung their hat on over the past few years since Joe Brady took over that offense. So we're going to keep the strength to strength there, go with Emmanuel Pregnon. San Francisco 49ers up here at 27. They did just trade for Osa Odighizuwa from Dallas. I think he was a much needed interior pass rushing presence for their defensive line. So I'm kind of avoiding D tackle here. I think Jermon McCoy, just purely off value, could make a lot of sense. They do have solid starting corners: Denominator Lenore, Upton Stout, Renardo Green. But Jermon McCoy had top 10 caliber tape 2 years ago. Obviously didn't play this past year because of that ACL. But I think he's just too good to be at 27. And the Niners, who have done a really good job of playing that comp pick market, I think you can kind of, address some of your more pressing needs a little bit later in the draft. I think some of that is predicated on, what happens with Trent Williams. If they can't figure out anything with Trent Williams, obviously there's a ginormous need at left tackle, so you might have to reach for that here at 27. Maybe with a guy like Caleb Lomu, or maybe you take Iheanacho and move him to the left side. I'm not really sure what you do at that point. But for now, Trent Williams is still technically on the team. I'm going to operate it as if he is playing with the 49ers next year and take the best player available in Jermon McCoy. The Texans here are another team that could use some interior offensive line help. Again, I just don't think there's a player here worth taking. Obviously, Pregnon goes off the board a couple of picks ago. I guess Jennings Dunker or Chase Pasantis would be kind of next up as far as interior offensive linemen go. I don't think either of them are first round caliber prospects. I'd be much more comfortable with them kind of in the middle of the second there. I'm going to go with another pairing I haven't seen a lot in Keldrick Falk. The Texans obviously have 2 stellar edge rushers already in Will Anderson and Danielle Hunter, who just got a huge 1-year extension. To me, Keldrick Falk isn't really coming in here to be, that third rotational, third down pass rusher. He's coming in here to be an absolute mauler in the run game. Probably plays a lot of interior defensive line here. And for me, if I have to trust a defensive coordinator to, get Keldrick Falk right as a pass rusher and help him make an impact right away as a run defender, it's DeMeco Ryans. He's been one of the best, defensive-minded coaches in the NFL over the past few years. So, a Keldrick Falk, obviously a guy that needs to take some steps in the right direction, but has all of the ability in the world. I love that fit with DeMeco Ryans. So I'm going to have him there at 28. The Chiefs back up here, took Ruben Bain, traded up for him, in fact. Took him at pick 5, obviously trading up with the Giants. To me, this is just Avion Terrell. I know Terrell doesn't necessarily fit what the Chiefs always like at corner. They often like those kind of bigger physical, press man type corners, which Avion Terrell isn't necessarily. He's a little bit smaller, not quite as heavy, arms aren't quite as long. But this is kind of exactly what they did with Trent McDuffie a few years ago. Obviously, they traded him, but I don't think they traded Trent McDuffie because he wasn't, playing the way that they wanted him to play. It just came down to the money thing. I think Avion Terrell is very similar in the way that, he might be a little bit smaller, but I think he can play on the outside. Maybe he's best as a nickel. They did bring in Kader Kohu to play that nickel role, but he was a guy that kind of missed all of last year with injury. It's only a 1-year deal, so I think Avion Terrell is a versatile piece in the cornerback room, can play inside and out. I think makes a lot of sense. And they've just had a lot of, they haven't been able to retain a lot of their starting corners. I think they like Noel Williams, the guy they drafted last year out of Cal. But they still have, they have some depth concerns. I think Avion Terrell can fill, a couple of needs. So we're going to go with him at pick 29. I think that's really good value. The Dolphins took Mansour Delane to be their CB1 at pick 11. Obviously, they're back up at 30 with Denver's first round pick after giving them Jalen Waddle about a week ago. Again, it sounds kind of counterintuitive, but to me, it's almost harder to pick for a team like Miami, just because they have so many needs. It's like, where do you even start? I think they could look at receiver, Casey Concepcion. I'm not really sure if they're looking for another smaller type receiver. Not to say he's not a good player. I'm just not really sure if he's, the biggest impact they could possibly make here. Ty Simpson, I'm not quite sure that's where you want to look here. Eli Stowers is not in the first. Man, maybe you look at O-line. They have, Iheanacho is here. They still have Austin Jackson. Patrick Paul played better last year. Man, I think maybe I'll look at defensive line and edge pass rusher. Um, they did bring in David Ojabo and the other guy's slipping my mind. They obviously have Chop Robinson. They brought in another guy. Who am I forgetting? Give me 1 second. I got to figure it out. Josh Uche. That's who I couldn't think of. That was gonna bother me if I couldn't figure it out. So they've made some depth additions at the defensive line kind of edge positions. That's not to say that they don't have more work to do there. I think I'm gonna go Zion Young here, who is down at 40. He's another guy I would have considered for a couple of these teams we picked for previously. But Zion Young is just a really solid player. Another guy who's just steadily improved over his time at Missouri. He's a big, heavy-handed, long-armed, pass rushing plus run defense type of player. Hasn't necessarily had stellar production as far as box stats go. 8 sacks this past year, up from 3 the year prior. I really, really like Zion Young, and I think for Jeff Hafley, I'm expecting, maybe some more 4-3. I think he could fit as a 4-3 defensive end. I have no problem with, him having his hand in the dirt and getting after the passer. I think that makes a lot of sense. I think if the Dolphins can come out of the first round with Zion Young and Mansour Delane, their team's not going to be good next year no matter what they do. But I think you have two guys that you're really, really excited about for the future, and can be key pieces on a defense for a defensive-minded head coach. So I really like that. The Patriots here, they still have some pretty significant O-line concerns. Will Campbell supposedly sticking at left tackle. We'll see how that goes. Hopefully he can make some improvements from where he left off in the Super Bowl. They do still have Morgan Moses at right tackle. He was healthy last year for the first time in quite a while. I'm not sure if they're willing to make that bet again. So with that in mind, I think I'm just going to go Maxi Iheanacho. A guy who's really flown up draft boards as well. Had a really good Senior Bowl. Has some really good measurables. He's been a consistent starter over the past 2 years for the Sun Devils. He's a guy who's had a really interesting story. He just started playing football like 4 years ago, so he's still relatively new to not only position but the sport. So I think, pairing him with a guy like Mike Vrabel, I think, you really bet on, Vrabel getting the best out of a guy like Iheanacho and, having a potential, solid right tackle to pair with your potentially solid left tackle of the future. I think that makes a lot of sense. So I'm going to go Max Iheanacho there. And then the Seattle Seahawks, your Super Bowl champions, picking at 32. I'm tempted to just go to Jadarian Price, who is no means the best player available, but they have such a huge need at running back now after losing Kenneth Walker. They haven't signed anybody else. Charbonnet, may not be ready to start the year. So just based off need, which I really don't love to do, I would consider Jadarian Price here at 32. But there's a lot of other good players I think make a lot of sense. Uchenna Nwosu's in the last year of his contract, and they lost Boye Mafe. So I think Cassius Howell, despite some of his length concerns, I think could make a lot of sense as a rotational pass rusher. Mike McDonald loves to deploy, a multitude of pass rushers, keep those guys fresh, and just ruin the quarterback's day. I think Cassius Howell, obviously the length is a real thing, right? It is concerning, but he's been so dang productive. He was the best pass rusher in the SEC last year. I think he can make a lot of sense. And then corner, obviously they lose Reek Woolen. I think Colton Hood can make a lot of sense, kind of filling in. I love D'Angelo Pons. The idea of having him and Witherspoon in the same defensive back room is something that I'd be really excited about, man. Just two guys who are undersized, who just play with their hair on fire. I really like that idea too. I do think I am going to end on Cassius Howell here, though. I think he just might be the best player available. And for a team that did lose some pretty meaningful pass rushers, I think he kind of fits perfectly with what Mike McDonald likes to do on defense. So yeah, that's going to do it, man. Here's kind of a quick recap here of the picks we made. Obviously, a couple of trades in here. You got the Chiefs trading up for Ruben Bain, and then the Buccaneers trading up for a pass rusher as well in David Bailey. So yeah, I'd love to hear what you guys think. Obviously mock drafts are going to be all over the place. They always are, but let me know what you think. Did I draft for your favorite team? And if I did, what do you think? Would you have made a different pick? So yeah, that's going to do it for me. Not sure what the next episode's going to be, so that's another thing in the comments. If you have anything specific that you'd like to see or listen to, please feel free to let me know. Yeah, I hope you guys have a great day, and thanks for tuning in. See you later.